As passengers filed on a flight 293, Emily adjusted her perfectly pressed uniform, eyes scanning the crowd, mentally placing each one of them. She had done this for years and knew within a glance where people belonged. First class held a certain elegance, a certain standard, and Emily took it upon herself to protect that. So when Rachel stepped forward in her loose cardigan and jeans, Emily's eyebrows rose in instinctive appraisal. "Ma'am," she said with a tight smile, stepping in front of the aisle, blocking Rachel's path. "Are you sure you're in the right section?" Rachel raised her eyes, momentarily surprised, but smiled politely. "Yes, I'm in 3A. Emily's eyebrow shot up again. "First class, yes?" Rachel merely nodded and held out her boarding pass without a word, the small smile unwavering on her face. Emily gave the pass a brief, skeptical glance before stepping aside. "Please go ahead," she said, as if granting Rachel an unexpected favor. As Rachel walked past, another passenger, a young white man in a sharp business suit, breezed by behind her. Emily flashed him a bright smile and offered him a cheerful, "Welcome to first class, sir." His greeting was warm, completely free of the frost she'd just shown Rachel. Settling into her seat, Rachel observed as Emily continued her job, now all smiles and courteous tones as she welcomed the other passengers. Rachel watched her with a knowing gaze. She'd seen this before. The small sneers, the subtle digs, the mistakes that made her feel out of place. She'd endured it in countless rooms, meetings, and airports. She didn't need a title or luxury clothes to know how she was viewed by people like Emily. As soon as Rachel's seatbelt was buckled, Emily appeared at her side again, clutching a tightly bound menu. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked curtly, her tone laced with just a hint of impatience. Rachel didn't miss it, but her smile was effortless. "Yes, water would be great." "Thank you." Emily nodded, but only after a moment of hesitation. "Water, of course," she replied, her tone implying she expected Rachel to ask for something cheaper. She quickly delivered the water, not without bumping Rachel's elbow, with a hasty motion as she placed the cup on her tray. "Oops," Emily murmured, though no apology followed. Rachel only nodded, her calm demeanor irritating Emily more than any complaint could have. But Emily wasn't done yet. As she moved down the aisle, she whispered loudly enough to the attendant behind her, "I wonder if we're doing enough to keep our standards up these days." Her eyes flicked back to Rachel, who continued reading her book without reaction. Mid-flight, as Rachel tried to adjust her seat, Emily swept back over, her voice pitched with impatience. "Is there a problem?" "No, just getting comfortable," Rachel replied smoothly. Emily's polite facade cracked slightly. "We do ask that our first-class passengers treat the seats with care, ma'am," she said, clearly implying that Rachel couldn't afford to do otherwise. Rachel's eyes met hers, steady, unwavering, but Emily didn't flinch, instead just shaking her head and muttering, "Unbelievable." A few seats down, a middle-aged woman watched the exchange with a frown. She whispered to her husband, "Is it just me? Or is she being really rude to that woman?" He nodded, muttering something about how blatant the attitude was. Rachel, still undeterred, waited patiently until Emily left, glancing down at her book but absorbing every detail of the interaction. She had expected some judgment, perhaps, but the disdain Emily showed was remarkable. Years of experience had taught Rachel that attitudes like this rarely changed without meaningful action, and the weight of responsibility settled heavily on her. For now, though, she would observe and absorb. As Emily passed her on another round, Rachel tried once more to make a polite request. "Excuse me, when you have a moment, could I have a coffee, please?" Emily stopped, her face just barely masking her irritation. "We have an array of options," she replied, rattling off a list without a hint of friendliness. "Which one?" "Just black, thank you," Rachel said, undeterred by Emily's coldness. "Right," Emily responded, glancing at her again as if to memorize her face. Someone she didn't expect to see again, and definitely not in first class. Minutes later, when she returned, the coffee was barely warm, but Rachel said nothing, only thanked her calmly. Emily gave a short, dismissive nod. "Well, if you need anything else," she said, her voice just a notch above condescension, "just let me know. But try to decide all at once, all right? Makes it easier for us." Rachel smiled gently. "Of course. Thank you." The man in the suit across the aisle shot Rachel an empathetic look, and Rachel returned it with a nod, aware of the small network of glances and whispers from the other passengers. The tension grew as the flight progressed, and Emily, seemingly emboldened, ignored Rachel's polite glances and questions, subtly leaving her to fend for herself while she lavished attention on the other passengers. Toward the end of the flight, a different attendant approached Rachel, gently asking if she needed anything. Rachel noticed the difference at once and gave her a warm thank you, watching Emily's reaction from the corner of her eye as she observed the exchange. She saw Emily stiffen, the flicker of recognition on her face, that a stranger was giving Rachel the respect she'd withheld. As the plane began its descent, Rachel folded her book, placing it back in her bag with a sense of finality. She'd seen enough to know exactly what changes needed to be made. Emily's behavior had cemented Rachel's resolve to bring the airline into a new era of empathy and accountability. The last glance Emily gave her before touchdown was still laced with the same subtle disdain, oblivious to the truth that waited to greet them on the ground. As the flight cruised over the clouds, Emily strolled down the aisle, ignoring Rachel with a practiced indifference. She greeted other passengers warmly, checking on the business travelers and regulars she recognized, making sure they felt cared for. But when her eyes fell on Rachel, any trace of hospitality faded. Rachel noticed every slight but maintained her calm, meeting each one with polite silence. For her, this flight was an opportunity to see the culture of the company firsthand, even if it came wrapped in Emily's cool dismissal. She sipped her lukewarm coffee, fully aware that Emily had neglected to offer a refill, as she had to every other passenger in first class. Then came the meal service. "Ma'am," Emily said as she approached Rachel's seat with her tray in hand, "you're aware that our first-class dining service is slightly elevated, yes?" Her tone was thinly veiled, her smile anything but kind. "It's a 3-course service and it might feel different. I'll explain each course as we go, so you won't be, surprised." Rachel simply looked up, her face as composed as ever. "Thank you. I'd appreciate that." Emily handed her the tray with forced grace and leaned in slightly. "This is the starter," she said, her voice dropping. "A chilled shrimp cocktail. It's quite delicate. Not for everyone, but I hope you enjoy it." Rachel nodded, unfazed. She picked up her fork with a steady hand and began eating, while Emily stood for a moment, watching, as if expecting some reaction. "Is there anything else, Emily?" Rachel asked with a slight smile, catching her off guard by using her name. Emily's mouth pressed into a thin line, clearly disconcerted that Rachel had taken note of her name tag. "No, ma'am," Emily said, her tone clipped. She spun on her heel and moved to the next row, where she served the other passengers with full, unforced smiles, chatting with the elderly couple across the aisle as if they were longtime friends. Rachel listened to the warmth in Emily's voice, each laugh and word dripping with politeness, and felt the quiet burn of resentment in her chest. She remembered the many boardrooms, conferences, and meetings she'd attended, where the underestimation had been painfully obvious, until she'd proven every one of them wrong. And this time, she intended to address it in a way that could reshape the entire culture. When Emily returned to collect her tray, her expression was haughty, as if she couldn't wait to clear Rachel's space and finish with her. She barely made eye contact. "Will you be having the main course?" she asked with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. Rachel looked up, her own eyes calm and steady. Yes, please. Emily nodded curtly. It's a tenderloin, cooked to perfection. But we can prepare something simpler if that's more to your liking, she said, her voice low and patronizing. Rachel held her gaze, speaking with the kind of composure that only deep experience could lend. Tenderloin sounds perfect, she replied. I'll take it exactly as it's prepared for everyone else. Thank you. Emily's polite smile faltered just slightly. Of course, she said, a hint of annoyance in her tone as she turned away. A few seats back, a young woman, who had been observing the whole interaction, leaned toward her husband and whispered, "Can you believe how she's treating that woman? She's being so rude." Her husband shook his head, muttering, "This isn't right. That flight attendant is acting like she owns first class." Rachel heard the murmurs but kept her eyes on her book, her expression serene. She didn't need to react. Others were noticing for her. But beneath her calm, she felt a flicker of anger. She'd always known she'd face challenges, but the blatant disrespect here only confirmed her purpose. When the tenderloin arrived, Emily placed it down without comment. Rachel took her time, eating with a quiet dignity that seemed to irk Emily even more. With every polite question Rachel asked, every calm response she gave, she felt Emily's anger tighten. Finally, as the flight neared its descent, Emily returned one last time to Rachel's seat, her tone saccharine and her smile tight. "We'll be landing shortly. I trust you found everything satisfactory," she asked with a barely concealed sneer. Rachel looked up, her calm unwavering. "It was adequate, thank you." Emily's mouth twitched slightly. "Adequate?" Rachel inclined her head slightly, her voice kind but direct. "Yes, I'd say that sums it up. Adequate." Emily's composure finally cracked. She gave a tight nod and turned away without a word, clearly irritated by Rachel's unshakable politeness. She returned to her fellow flight attendant, leaning close to mutter, "She acts like she owns the place, doesn't she? Like she's someone important." The nerve! The other attendant looked uncomfortable, glancing at Rachel with a sympathetic expression but saying nothing. As the plane began its final descent, Rachel leaned back, closing her eyes briefly, mentally preparing herself for what lay ahead. The cold reception she'd received had given her all the information she needed. She knew exactly what her next steps would be once they touched down. When the seatbelt sign dinged, and Emily moved down the aisle for her final check, she paused by Rachel's seat, her eyes briefly locking with Rachel's. For a second, something like recognition flashed across her face, but she quickly masked it, moving on without a word. Rachel smiled to herself. This flight was about to change everything for both of them. She knew that by the time they disembarked, Emily's world was about to be upended in ways she never expected. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Emily did her final checks, feeling the usual satisfaction of a job well done. She ignored Rachel's aisle entirely, unwilling to grant her even a last glance. To Emily, this flight had been nothing more than a tedious encounter with a passenger she deemed out of place. But the scene awaiting her at the gate was anything but usual. As the plane doors opened, a group of executives gathered just beyond, looking toward the first-class cabin with excited anticipation. A man in a sharp suit held a bouquet, while others wore expressions of professional eagerness. Emily noticed them immediately, assuming they must be waiting for one of the businessmen who had sat near Rachel. She straightened, smoothing her uniform, preparing to greet them herself if necessary. Passengers began to file out, and when Rachel rose, Emily watched her move down the aisle with that same composed stride. She still hadn't pieced together who Rachel truly was, and she certainly didn't expect the executive's eyes to shift to Rachel the moment she emerged. Rachel's posture straightened as she stepped through the exit, her calm presence undiminished. One of the executives, holding a bouquet of deep red roses, immediately stepped forward, extending his hand with a warm smile. "Ms. Taylor, welcome, and congratulations on your first flight with us as VP." he said, loud enough for Emily to hear as she stood just feet away, frozen in shock. Rachel's smile was genuine, gracious. "Thank you, Greg. I'm glad to be here," she replied, shaking his hand. Emily's stomach sank. She watched, completely frozen, as the group greeted Rachel with smiles, introductions, and handshakes, each person radiating admiration and respect. There was no mistaking it now. Rachel Taylor was not only important, she was their new vice president. The executives clustered around her, speaking to her with admiration and excitement. Greg handed her the bouquet, congratulating her once again. Emily's face flushed, her mind racing to absorb what was unfolding before her. The woman she'd belittled, ignored, and insulted throughout the flight was her new boss. Rachel glanced back just once, her gaze meeting Emily's from a distance, and there was something undeniable in her eyes, a calm understanding that bordered on pity. She turned back to her team, but Emily felt the weight of that glance, as if Rachel had seen straight through her. Emily fumbled with her clipboard, feeling suddenly conspicuous. The other flight attendants on the team were watching her, their expressions a mix of surprise and discomfort. She tried to hide her reaction, but her hands shook as she clutched the clipboard, her face betraying the inner turmoil she felt. One of the executives, a tall woman in a tailored suit, approached Rachel with a welcoming smile. "Ms. Taylor, we'd love to introduce you to the rest of the team properly, though it seems you've already met some of our crew here today." Rachel's smile was gracious, though there was an edge of authority in her response. "Yes, it's been an insightful flight. I've had a thorough look at our service standards from a passenger's perspective." Emily felt her heart drop at those words, the implication landing like a punch. She realized with chilling clarity that every moment Rachel had spent in first class had been a test, a silent, hidden evaluation of the service. And Emily knew, without a doubt, that she had failed. Still reeling, Emily watched as Rachel and the executives moved together down the jet bridge, their voices carrying as they discussed upcoming meetings and plans for the airline. Emily caught bits of conversation, plans for inclusivity training, discussions on improving customer experience, and a new vision for the company. As the voices faded down the jet bridge, Emily's mind whirred with memories of the flight. The cold remarks, the dismissive glances, the humiliation she'd heaped onto Rachel with every interaction. She realized now that every sarcastic comment, every sneer had been heard, noted, and understood by Rachel, who had likely seen right through her thinly veiled hostility from the start. "Emily," came the low voice of her fellow flight attendant, Maria, snapping her back to reality. Maria's face was a mixture of pity and subtle satisfaction as she looked at her. "Do you realize who that was?" Emily swallowed hard, trying to keep her composure, but her voice shook as she replied. I do now." Maria's raised eyebrows and faint smirk said it all. "Then I suppose it's time to brush up on those service skills." She walked away, leaving Emily standing alone in the aisle, her face still burning with humiliation. For the first time, Emily felt the weight of her own prejudice, of the years she'd spent passing judgment on passengers she deemed unworthy of first-class service. She'd justified it as a dedication to standards, but now, facing the impact of her actions, she understood that her behavior had stemmed from something far darker and more personal. The terminal was mostly empty now, and as Emily gathered her things, she felt a sickening sense of dread. Rumors would spread, she knew. The rest of the flight crew would surely talk, and her behavior would become the subject of gossip within the airline. And worse yet, she knew that Rachel Taylor, her new boss, would remember every slight, every insult. As she stepped off the plane, Emily's mind spun with questions. Would Rachel retaliate? Would she file a report? Perhaps Rachel would be the type of executive who dealt with her employees' shortcomings decisively, pushing for consequences without hesitation. And yet, as Emily reflected on Rachel's calm demeanor, she felt the sting of something worse than a reprimand, a quiet resolve in Rachel's eyes that hinted at a deeper mission, a purpose that went beyond merely punishing a single flight attendant's rude behavior. Emily made her way through the terminal in a daze, consumed by the gravity of what had just happened. She understood now, too late, that this encounter would mark a turning point in her life. For Rachel, it might have been one more moment of dignity in the face of prejudice. But for Emily, it was an unforgettable lesson, one that had left her stripped bare, exposed, and irrevocably changed. As she walked toward the employee exit, she couldn't shake the weight of Rachel's steady gaze, a reminder that respect should be offered without reservation, and that the passengers she once looked down on could, in a single flight, become the faces of her future. In the days following that flight, Emily's world unraveled piece by piece. Word of the incident had circulated among the crew, and although no one said anything to her directly, she felt their whispers like a sharp breeze whenever she entered the room. The familiar comfort of her uniform, once a badge of seniority and respect, now felt like a spotlight she couldn't escape. But the worst of it was Rachel's quiet presence. Rachel had wasted no time implementing new policies across the airline. Among the changes were comprehensive training modules on inclusivity, respect, and empathy in customer service, policies Rachel herself was overseeing. Emily dreaded these new sessions, fearing they would bring her directly back into the orbit of the woman she had humiliated. On a gray Wednesday afternoon, Emily sat in the back of a training room with a dozen other flight attendants. At the front, Rachel stood with a poised, commanding presence, addressing the group with a calm authority that made Emily feel smaller than ever. "Today," Rachel began, her voice strong and steady, "we're here to talk about empathy in customer interactions. Every passenger, no matter their background, their attire, or even their demeanor, deserves respect. This respect is non-negotiable and is the foundation of who we are as a company." Emily shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Rachel's words hit harder than any reprimand. She couldn't help but feel that each sentence was aimed directly at her. She glanced around, wondering if the others knew, if they saw through her mask of composure. Rachel continued, her gaze sweeping over the room, pausing briefly on Emily. "Respect is earned and built through every interaction, through every glance, every tone of voice. I've been on both sides of this interaction myself," she added, a slight edge of steel in her voice. "And I know firsthand how a single encounter can shape a person's perception of our brand and of us." Emily's face flushed. She recalled the flight in painstaking detail, her dismissive glances, her tone dripping with sarcasm, and every slight she'd inflicted upon Rachel without a second thought. Each memory sharpened the sting of shame that now sat heavily in her chest. As the session ended, Rachel invited questions. A younger flight attendant raised her hand and asked, "What's the best way to address our own biases? I mean, sometimes they're unconscious, right?" Rachel nodded. "Exactly. Biases are often rooted deep within us, shaped by our own experiences and misconceptions. But addressing them requires honesty, a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves. And in this role, it's essential. Each of us has a responsibility to create an environment of inclusivity." Emily felt her pulse quicken. She had heard words like these before, even in her early years, but she dismissed them, telling herself that tough love was part of the job, a necessary guard against difficult or entitled passengers. Now, though, her own justification seemed flimsy, hollow even. As the group filed out, Rachel's assistant gestured for Emily to stay behind. Her heart sank as she watched the others leave, offering her sympathetic glances. Emily's mind spun with scenarios, each worse than the last. Would Rachel confront her now, directly? Would she be reprimanded privately? When the room emptied, Rachel approached her, her expression unreadable. "Emily," she began, her voice calm but firm, I wanted to talk to you personally about what happened on the flight last week. Emily nodded, swallowing hard. Yes, of course, she replied, forcing her voice to remain steady. I wanted to apologize, Miss Taylor. I realized that my behavior was unacceptable, and I deeply regret the way I treated you. Rachel's gaze softened just a touch, though her expression remained measured. I appreciate your apology, but I need you to understand that this isn't just about me, Emily. It's about every passenger who has ever felt dismissed, judged, or unwelcome. Emily nodded, feeling the weight of her words sink in. She knew Rachel was right. Her actions hadn't only hurt Rachel personally. They reflected a pattern of behavior that could impact every passenger, every interaction. Rachel continued, her tone resolute. This role comes with a responsibility, Emily, to treat every individual who steps onto our planes with dignity. I want you to consider that each passenger might be someone who has worked just as hard as you to be here, who may have their own struggles, and who deserves the same respect you'd give anyone else. Emily's voice was barely a whisper. I understand, and I know I have a lot to work on. Rachel nodded. I want you to participate in the empathy training sessions moving forward, not only as a participant, but as a mentor. I believe that if you can face these biases directly, you might be able to guide others away from them. The shock of Rachel's words left Emily speechless. She had expected punishment, perhaps even a demotion. But this, an opportunity to lead, to transform, was something she hadn't anticipated. Rachel continued, her voice softening slightly. Everyone has the capacity to change, Emily, including you. I believe that owning your mistakes is the first step, but it's only one part. The real work is in ensuring those mistakes aren't repeated. Emily nodded, the weight of Rachel's words sinking in deeply. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I won't let you down. Rachel regarded her for a long moment, her gaze thoughtful. I hope so, because Emily, if I see this behavior repeated, if any passenger, any colleague is ever treated with anything less than respect, there won't be a second chance. Emily's chest tightened. The message was clear. Rachel's kindness came with boundaries, and her trust was conditional. Understood, Ms. Taylor, she replied, a newfound determination hardening in her voice. Thank you for giving me the chance to make it right. Rachel offered a small nod. Good. Then I expect to see your name on the list of participants for the upcoming training sessions. With that, Rachel turned, leaving Emily alone in the quiet of the empty training room. The silence echoed around her, but this time, Emily didn't feel resentment. Instead, she felt the sharp clarity of purpose. For the first time in years, she knew that she could no longer hide behind her excuses, her bitterness, or her seniority. If she was to earn her place here, to regain the respect she'd so carelessly thrown away, she would have to rebuild herself from the ground up, starting with a respect that went beyond appearances. As she walked out of the training room, she took a deep breath, feeling the weight of a second chance she'd almost lost. And this time, she promised herself she wouldn't waste it. Months passed, and Emily found herself in the middle of her transformation, a shift she hadn't expected would run so deep. At first, attending empathy training and mentoring sessions had felt like a punishment. Every scenario they reviewed, every role-playing exercise reminded her of that flight and of Rachel's calm, unflinching gaze. Yet, as each session progressed, Emily began to feel a weight lift, a strange kind of freedom emerging as she unpacked her own prejudices and insecurities. As part of Rachel's vision, Emily's airline team had become a model for other branches. She noticed her colleagues, some who had been just as skeptical as she was in the beginning, adopting the same approach Rachel had modeled. Respect, dignity, and care became the new norms, and complaints from passengers began to drop as satisfaction levels rose. Emily felt proud in a way she hadn't in years. Her seniority was now more than tenure. It was backed by the values she demonstrated every day. One morning, as she reviewed a new schedule, her manager pulled her aside. "Rachel wants to see you in her office," he said, an approving smile on his face. The praise she saw in his eyes took her by surprise. "Whatever you're doing, Emily, keep it up. You've made quite an impression." Her heart beat faster as she approached Rachel's office. This wasn't the same Emily who had boarded that fateful flight with the presumption that she knew every passenger. She was nervous, yes, but also confident in a way that didn't depend on looking down on others. She knocked softly, and Rachel's voice invited her in. Rachel looked up from her desk, her expression warm but serious. She motioned for Emily to sit, taking a moment to close her laptop and fold her hands on the desk. "Emily," she began, "I've been hearing good things about you." Emily couldn't hide her surprise. "Thank you, Ms. Taylor. I've been working hard to turn things around." Rachel gave a small nod, leaning forward slightly. "You've made impressive progress, and it's reflected in your colleagues' responses, in our training feedback, and, most importantly, in our passengers' experiences. This is exactly what I envisioned when I started these changes." Emily felt a swell of pride, tempered by humility. "I owe that to you, Ms. Taylor. I wouldn't have changed if it hadn't been for the way I treated you on that flight." Rachel's gaze softened, but her voice remained steady. "Emily, I believe that everyone deserves a second chance, just as you were given one. And you've proven that change is possible. But remember, this isn't about me. It's about how you've chosen to grow. This company needs leaders who understand that respect is our most valuable currency." Emily nodded, absorbing every word. She understood now that Rachel's approach was never just about accountability. It was about fostering a culture where accountability came naturally, where empathy was the default. Rachel continued, "That's why I'd like to promote you to lead one of our pilot programs in customer care. It's an initiative focused on mentoring new hires and creating a respectful, welcoming experience for every passenger." Emily's jaw dropped slightly. "Me? I'm honored, Ms. Taylor. I don't know what to say." Rachel smiled. "You don't have to say anything. Your actions have spoken loudly enough. But there is something you need to remember. The way you choose to treat people is what they will remember long after they've stepped off the plane. I'm entrusting you to pass that understanding on." As the weight of Rachel's words settled over her, Emily felt the gravity of her new role. She'd gone from dismissing her passengers as faces in a crowd to recognizing the uniqueness in each one. The promotion wasn't just a new title. It was a responsibility to extend that understanding and respect to others in ways she hadn't thought possible. Rachel rose, signaling that their meeting was over, but as Emily turned to leave, Rachel spoke again. "Emily," she said, her tone softer, "I've seen people stumble in many ways in this industry. You're one of the few I've seen get back up and make it right. That's rare, and it's something to be proud of." Emily's voice was thick with emotion. "Thank you, Ms. Taylor. I won't let you down." She left Rachel's office with a renewed sense of purpose, feeling a strength she hadn't known she possessed. Her journey from a proud, hardened flight attendant to someone willing to face her own flaws had changed her irrevocably. And as she walked through the terminal, passing by travelers from every walk of life, she saw them with new eyes, not as passengers, but as people, each with their own story, each deserving of respect. In the following months, the pilot program became a success. Emily watched as new flight attendants took to their roles with empathy, embracing a culture that Rachel had established, but that they all now carried forward. Emily found herself mentoring them in the same way Rachel had mentored her, leading with both humility and pride. Years passed, and as Rachel's impact on the company grew, so did Emily's. She had come full circle, not by moving up a ladder, but by changing from within. She no longer needed recognition to feel validated. Her sense of worth was grounded in the simple truth she now lived by. Respect wasn't a privilege. It was a choice, a commitment she renewed every day. One afternoon, while preparing for a flight, she saw a passenger struggling with their luggage. Without a second thought, Emily stepped forward, offering a genuine smile and a helping hand. The passenger thanked her with surprise and appreciation, and as Emily moved on, she thought back to her first encounter with Rachel, now realizing just how far she'd come. And somewhere in the quiet satisfaction of that moment, Emily understood the real meaning of change, that it was less about who she'd been and more about who she'd chosen to become.